All right, we're back with you, Breitbart News Tonight, 866-957-2874, 866-95-PATRIOT. And on the line with us right now, we have a very good friend of Breitbart.com for many years. Frank Gaffney is the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy. And by the way, Frank, I don't know if you remember this, but when I was in law school many moons ago, I actually organized an event for you about the abuse of Ivy League institutions to sanitize Sharia-compliant finance that could be used to fund terrorism. I don't know if you remember that. It was at Harvard Law School.
I generally don't remember what I had for breakfast, so this is getting foggier and foggier, Joel, to be honest with you, but I actually do remember that, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you for remembering it as well.
Yeah. I just was recalling that today and thinking, I wonder if you remember that. Oh, well, good, glad you do. It was very interesting. Harvard, of course, a repository for many materials as well as many donations from the Middle East about Sharia law, and there's this whole idea of Sharia-compliant finance. But that's a topic for another day, very interesting one. But let's talk about the Kurds, because folks are having trouble making head or tail of this situation. Rebecca and I have been batting it around for the last 40 minutes or so. Give us your take on what happened today and yesterday in the agreement with Turkey and President Trump's tweets and the reaction thereto.
Well, it's not actually unrelated to that discussion in Harvard so many years ago, Joel, because I think fundamentally what's going on at the moment is how are we going to address the very real phenomenon of Sharia supremacism in the Middle East, whether it is being exhibited by the Islamic State, which I hate to have to say is not defeated. It is reorganizing. It is rebuilding. It is finding new opportunities in Iran, in Iraq, in Syria to rebuild its strength. I say Iran, I think they're there, but they're for sure in Iraq, and they're for sure in Syria. But they're also in Nigeria, which is, again, perhaps a topic for another day. But we are kidding ourselves if we think we've put them out of business, even in the caliphate business. They're building one anew and far more formidable in Nigeria at the moment. But this is Sharia supremacism, of course, is something that brings together three other enemies of this country. And I use that term advisedly when I talk about Turkey. It is an ally no more. Yes, it is, of course, still part of NATO, but it has proven itself for years now under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, its president, to be unreliable at best, and at worst to be actively operating with our enemies like, the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and Iran and another so-called ally, but very much hostile one, Qatar as well. So when you look at all of those forces that are at work, what we're looking at doing here with respect to having a relatively small number of Americans somewhere in Syria, or withdrawing them to someplace else in Syria or withdrawing them altogether, is unfortunately going to be very, very much monitored by and responded to by these Sharia supremacists. And I think that's the way we have to think about this in terms of the advisability of pulling out in part or in whole.
Does that tie us down forever? I mean, Americans looking at these organizations understand that you don't necessarily need an infrastructure to become a radical Islamic terrorist. The ideology is all out there. The publications are freely available on the internet. It doesn't take much to obtain a weapon or to build a bomb, and you can just activate yourself. And we wouldn't say that we have a part of the caliphate in the United States, but the Boston Marathon bombings and other attacks here in California, we had the San Bernardino shooting in late 2015. These terrorists can self-radicalize even if they are born in the United States and have every opportunity. So Americans look around the world and say, well, maybe if we can't stop them everywhere, the best thing to do is to secure the homeland and destroy the caliphate territorially, which we did in Raqqa and in Syria and Iraq and so forth, and not overcommit ourselves to an endless military deployment. I mean, that seems to be the argument Trump is making.
Yeah, I think it is. Two things I think, Joel, need to be clearly understood. One is the problem is not terrorism. Terrorism is a manifestation of jihad, which is obligatory for those who adhere to Sharia. It can be pursued violently, which is what we call terrorism, more or less, or it can be pursued stealthily, which is happening in our country in a very big way. And we kid ourselves if we don't think that ultimately its objective is to turn us into part of the caliphate too. It may seem incredible, it may seem crazy, and yet that's the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood in our country, and they make no bones about it. I would just say, with respect to tying ourselves down for endless wars, history is replete with examples in which that happens to countries. I think what we have done in Afghanistan, what we've done to varying degrees in Iraq, has been something that has clearly fed the unhappiness of an awful lot of Americans, including President Trump, obviously, to this idea that we're just going to continue to spend lives and treasure trying to secure something that is unlikely to ever materialize in those lands. A democracy, for example, a pro-Western culture and civilization. Where we have to fight, not because we want to, but because the enemy insists on it, the goal should be to do it as inexpensively and with as few Americans involved as possible. And that seems to me to be what we've accomplished in Syria. And what pains me about the prospect that we might pull out, the president says we've only got 50 men in this one area that the Turks are poised to invade. That may be right, that may be wrong. There's supposed to be about 1,000 of them all told in Syria. That is a very small commitment. It doesn't even qualify, I would argue, as endless war because it's really barely a presence at all. But what it is enabling us to do is to work with Kurds who are doing the bulk of the fighting. And they frankly have no choice but to do that fighting because they don't have someplace else to go to. They have to do it in those lands because that's where they live. So my own view of this is that we shouldn't engage in foolish exercises. Nation building has come to be the shorthand for it, where it's totally improbable to succeed and would cost us far more than we're willing to pay, either in lives or in treasure, to try to accomplish any further. But where we can do this sort of holding at bay, for want of a better term, the Sharia supremacists, whether they're the Turks, whether they're the Iranians, whether they're the Qataris, whether they're the Taliban, whether they're the Pakistanis, whether they're, the jihadis throughout the Middle East, some of whom are, again, nominally our friends. And we can do it with a very small footprint, a very small presence, and a very small cost. That seems to me to be the goal that we should be striving for, not something that we should be tearing up by the roots.
Let me ask you this, though. Given the fact that Trump has made some suggestions earlier about wanting to do this, and he certainly campaigned on wanting to decrease American intervention abroad where it was voluntary, I won't use the term unnecessary, but where it was an intervention of choice, he certainly seemed cool to that and said, we're going to try to bring people home and so forth. Given that he's been talking that way for quite some time, how do you explain the failure of some kind of local leadership to emerge among the Kurds to point toward a political solution to reach out and offer the Americans and others some ideas about how things might move forward, whether kind of supervisory autonomy or political independence? I know that there was a referendum a few years ago that only Israel recognized. So why hasn't there been more of an effort from the Kurds to say to the United States and others, we're going to help you out here, you help us, and we will build toward independence and self-sufficiency?
Well, because the Turks won't allow it, because the Syrians won't allow it, because the Iraqis won't allow it, because the Iranians won't allow it. That's pretty much why there's not an independent Kurdish state. I personally would favor it. I think it makes a lot of sense for the Kurds, for sure, and I think for our interests as well. But all of those nations would much sooner destroy the Kurds than accommodate their national aspirations. So I think, honestly, Joel, and this is something on which obviously serious people can respectfully disagree. My own feeling about it is that where you find people like the Kurds who are willing to do the fighting for what amount to pretty much our interests as well as theirs, and we can do it, as I say, with minimal expenditure in terms of hardware, in terms of boots on the ground, as they say, let alone loss of life and larger expenditures. Those are the sorts of things that I think the American people are perfectly content with. Honestly, I don't see any sign that there's this huge demand to have American troops out of Syria at this point. Do you? Do people want endless wars? No. If you ask them, do you want endless wars? No. But if this isn't really an endless war, if this amounts to sustaining friends in the region and doing so at the expense of enemies, I think most Americans would say, if you can do it on the cheap, that's okay with me. And that old adage from Sulla, the Roman general, about no better friend, no worse enemy, is, I think, a pithy way to describe the ideal in international affairs. You will have more friends and you will have fewer enemies if you conduct yourself in a way that strengthens your friends, works with them, shows that you're reliable as an ally, and fewer enemies than if you do it the other way around. And what I must say I am concerned about is I fear that every nation on the world stage today that we have reason to be concerned about, notably China, notably Russia, notably Iran, and others, North Korea, are looking at what we're doing here. They can't, I'm sure, figure out why we would pull out, but what they will interpret it as evidence of is a lack of resolve. And I think that will cost us very dearly, not just in Syria, probably, but elsewhere around the world. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that's likely.
Well, they really interpret it as a lack of resolve, and we are coming up on the hour here, so I'll just try to be as brief as I can. We've been very aggressive on Iran in terms of sanctions. We've moved military assets into the region when necessary. Do you think that doesn't have an effect also? I mean, maybe Trump just did this because he could, because he's been tough enough on sanctions and other points that he can have more freedom to lessen our commitment in Syria.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think it's a highly subjective answer. The question isn't so much what I think as what the Iranians think. And my fear is that when they destroy half of the Saudi production capacity for energy export with impunity, that probably is something that is more instructive to them than all of the sanctions that we're imposing on them. And I favor those sanctions, and I support the president's approach here. But I do worry that very practical, seeming lack of resolve in their eyes is emboldening them and not having the desired deterrent effect.
I don't know if Rebecca wants to jump in here. I have one more question here.
She's been very quiet.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm just listening to you guys.
Uncharacteristically quiet.
My big question, though, Joel, if I could just ask one really quick one, is the idea that 50 guys are the thing that's holding, the line between savagery and civilization. Doesn't seem, I can't understand, 50 guys, this is all we're talking about.
Well, that's what the president said. I don't know whether it's 50 guys or whether it's a larger percentage of 1,000. But whatever it is, it's a tripwire. It's a presence. It's a deterrent, and it's more powerful if it is clearly backed by resolve to do more if we need to. That's the thing that I'm concerned about. We're signaling the opposite right now.
Finally, I guess if you have 30 seconds. The Turks, did they give us anything in return? Do we know what Trump might have gotten from them in exchange for this commitment?
I doubt it. That's not the way Erdogan works. It's all a one-way street, I think, and this is one of the reasons why he is an ally no more.
Interesting point. Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy. It's always fascinating listening to you, Frank, giving us a perspective on the region, on the geopolitics of the region, on the concerns geopolitically for the entire world with every decision that is made. Folks, we're going to be taking your calls also next hour.
Mr. Gaffney, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. Take care.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.